Great. So our next presenters are David Heimer and Daniel Zimmerman, and they're going to talk to us about using drones for weed management. David Heimer is Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife's Noxious Weed Coordinator, and he oversees weed crews and provides support to wildlife area staff on projects regarding vegetation management and pesticide policy issues. Daniel Zimmerman is the North Puget Sound Weed Crew Supervisor for the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and he is responsible for Spartina eradication and is also tasked with other vegetation management projects from wetland to shrub steppe across the state. Daniel also spends the winter season as the Swan Mortality Biologist.
So today is not all on drone, but kind of on the story of how we ended up getting or trying to incorporate drones into kind of our veg management plan. So first off, the big thing we're doing is treating non-native cattail. It's the narrow leaf cattail that's pretty much, think of it as a cattail probably thin as a pencil. It's kind of taken over the South Skagit Delta, and it's kind of this high density. It's excluded a lot of open areas. We focus on down there is waterfowl hunting, trying to promote and the waterfowl as well as keeping open water for some of the fish species that we're all working to kind of help bolster back. Yeah, and this version is a lot more salt tolerant. And then also being the allelopathic, it kind of doesn't help anything else around it, and it just creates these really tall monocultures that you can kind of see in the back. So we kind of started in 2014, and we were using one of these marsh masters, and pretty much was just crushing the cattail. This kind of became obvious that with this amount of air that was in just the stem itself, the stems would float when the tide came back in. So we went and rented one of these things from Louisiana and started mowing it. We ended up doing this for a couple years, but essentially it did knock back some seed set and thinned it out very slightly. But it's essentially like mowing your lawn. It just keeps growing back, and would pretty much have to do multiple mowings in a season. We started pretty much just off the Skagit Wildlife area on the other side of the river with 50 acres, and then we've kind of started to scale up to a couple hundred acres a year as kind of the technology's improved. We now have one of these marsh masters with a big boom system. I believe it's about 40 feet wide, set up with spray computer that they use in precision agriculture, so it can track pretty much anytime each boom is on. So when you start going back through the tracks and the data, it'll show pretty much the patches that you missed or decided not to hit if there was only a couple stems of cattail and a lot more native vegetation. And that kind of helps bolster some of the seed bank with a lot of the natives. In 2018, we went through because there was a lot of questions on how much there actually was out there on the South Delta. All the blue are patches that were ground truth. We spent probably 6 weeks with 4 people going around to a lot of these places, and with phones with collector, which is what now field maps, and would pretty much just turn on a track line, walk around a patch, and then submit. Not at first, but after a while, we started going through and guessing how much was cattail. A lot of these marks here are things that are 50% or better. Things that were just a couple stems of cattail weren't included in the survey. So a lot of the challenges we end up going through is we have to leave from kind of up in here and bring them, that marsh master floats down, and we have to bring it all the way out into here to get any of the treatments. All of this dark stuff that you can kind of see here, that's cattail. And that's a lot of time And with our HPAs, you can only go at certain times. You can only cross channels at a certain distance. And as you'll see here in the next couple of slides, that some of the driftwood makes it real difficult to get into some places. So again, here's some of the equipment issues. Here's us towing it. There are mechanical issues that need to get replaced. Does need to get serviced, and it is kind of expensive and time consuming. Also, if you can see, if you don't get a nice little sandbar to go up, you're going up some steep banks and pretty much having to winch yourself up. Here's the wood debris that I was talking about. We've accidentally ended up in this area before we had this imagery, but you can kind of see some of these areas in here. This is all just driftwood that's floated in. And it's essentially like you just took a box of toothpicks and just dumped it on the ground. And those machines do not have the suspension or stamina to go over all that wood. And I mean, it's like you're sitting in a washing machine as you're trying to go over a lot of that stuff. And you do not want to end up losing a track going over this stuff in the field. That just makes your day rough. We ended up hiring a Agra services out of Pasco to come out and do some drone mapping and later do some spraying. So here's them going out, and we took them out in the boat. They set up in 2 spots and took a lot of aerial photography for us. And again, we did it earlier in the spring, partially because of that driftwood. So you could be able to go through and be able to map kind of where you can, where you can't go, and be able to see some of the channels so that when we go through and we can publish that into our field maps as a layer. And then it kind of gives operators, when they're in the Marshmaster, a better like visual of kind of like what's coming, so they're not getting stuck. So this is the whole product they ended up giving us. They ended up doing over 2,000 acres of the Delta. I then took the imagery that they produced and made a bunch of these little yellow areas that you could tell on there, and from surveys we've done before, that was the cattail that we were trying to go after. And then you had to go through and try to figure out landing points, because this drone comes in the trailer. Flight time on some of these spray drones is only like 8 minutes. So you kind of have to pick a bunch of different areas that you can get a landing zone, but also be able to get a boat to carry your chemical or in batteries and people back and forth. After I kind of made these polygons and kind of sent them to the contractor, and then they kind of figured out like what would work best for their equipment. So here's the kind of the trailer they bring. They have all their drones set up in there. They have a massive generator that's running, and a bunch of battery chargers on the outside. And then here's one kind of flying and us filling one up. And then kind of the landing pad that we wondered where one of those pins were. So these are what we ended up getting. This is the Agris T40, the max payload, 110 pounds there, and it is a massive drone at almost, say, 10 foot by 10 foot. Also, you can get a seed spreader with them, which is one thing that I'm kind of excited about, is that after you do a couple years of treatment or a year after, then you can come back in the spring or the winter and spread seed and try to get some of those natives kind of back in there. The little one is our Mavic, which is a multispectral. We use this to do all the mapping, since that one has like 45 minutes of flight time. And we're still trying to figure out how to use the multispectral enough. The thought was that we would be able to go and kind of figure out areas that were 100% of this cattail or whatever plant we're looking for, and kind of target specific, I guess, the lighting or reflection back. We haven't, or at least I haven't been able to kind of like narrow that down enough. Like this, it's not just, it doesn't just stick out like black and white. There's a lot of kind of shades of gray that you kind of have to wade through. Here's kind of like the controller for the T40. And this kind of shows like it's more or less kind of playing on a computer little video game, but you can kind of just go in there, you make your polygon on the map, and it has real good aerial mapping. And you can take the mapping too from your this Mavic and in the system on your computer, and then you can like push that imagery to the controller of the spray drone. And then with that, you can kind of modify which way you want to take the routes. And some of the ones that they do with the Mavic is, say, some of the spot spraying. I know the contractor we did just did a presentation on some potato beetles. They could take the Mavic, see where all the vegetation wasn't looking very good. And with that, they go through and they can just make little circles, and the spray drone will just kind of go up to that little spot, start spraying, spin in a circle, go to the next spot, spray in a circle. And so it can hit these smaller areas without just kind of getting all the plants. So here's one of the areas that we've done. You can kind of see where it was sprayed. We also kind of marked areas that we could see where there's native vegetation or areas that we've planted before that we didn't want hit. And I was really surprised on kind of the straight lines and the ability it has to just say, okay, it just moves out or stops one of the sprayers. So it's not hitting these sites that we want. Overall, the contractor ended up going through and mapping 2,700 acres there. We ended up treating 57 acres of the cattail, and then we did in the previous photo was all canary grass. So that was 23 acres, and they got that done in a couple hours. Again, the amount of time this technology or even just those couple days saved us was weeks of trying to use the Marsh Masters. And it's not just the spraying, like getting the Marsh Master and spraying, but it's the logistics of getting the equipment there, the transportation, waiting for the right tides, like just the amount of time that saved us. So you could just kind of, okay, you bring out your water, your chem, you kind of show up, get it done, and then you're gone. Instead of having all this large equipment that you're having to move back and forth that can break, a lot of the towing. That was one of the things too with the tides. You got to make sure you got enough to where even the boat can be towing us. It's things to consider when using the drones. It is a new technology. If anyone's ever gone to the DJI website and looking at the drones, their videos are fantastic and looks like it will solve all the world's problems. That is, from what we're hearing and seeing, is not true. They have just a really good marketing team. The one thing that we really struggled with in asking this contractor is kind of all the specific metadata we needed and we were looking for, and it came pretty apparent that they go out there, they do the mapping, they figure out what they need to spray, and they go spray it, and then their job's done. There's a lot of the stuff in the ARC, the GIS world, that they didn't really have down. They were still, I mean, it's a younger company, but they were still kind of trying to figure that out. Also, on our end, we were trying to figure out what we needed from them, and trying to talk to our GIS department, and like the lingo going from the GIS department to us to the contractor, there was just a lot of, it kind of turned into muddy water. Some of the cost too is the cost to host those layers, if you do the mapping, we're learning if you're just doing these big, massive, that couple thousand acre maps are pretty expensive to host online so that you can use them later. So luckily, being in a big enough agency, there's enough credits to be able to do that. But that's here and there. We're not going to be able to do this on a yearly basis. And then just the amount of time that we're asking our GIS division to spend with us on top of all their other projects. And this is, again, kind of a newer thing for even them, and just the importing and how to manipulate the data to what they need or what we're trying to get from it. Some of this too, being in the Delta, there's a lot of stuff that these spray drones they're usually spraying 10 feet above the ground. So you actually have to be relatively close to a lot of them, at least so you can keep line of sight, that's part of the drone licensing, the pilot things. And then also the Mavic, though, that when it's flying up at the max, 400 feet, it's actually pretty amazing how far you can see that out there. I think sometimes we've hit about the 3,800 feet away. So it's about 3/4 of a mile, somewhere in there, that you can see this away. So you can actually get large chunks of mapping done at once. And then we also figured out too, the equipment to kind of help support. We had probably more people than we needed, but the amount of, again, if these batteries only last 8 minutes of flight time on the spray drones, you have to have a lot of batteries. I think there was times in our boat, we probably had 20 batteries, and they're probably 10, 15 pounds a piece. And it takes 2 batteries in a drone at once. So there was a lot of shuffling back and forth between who's out and how many batteries are out there versus how many we have on the charger. And so there was a lot of logistics of going back and forth. And then again, those nozzles are so fine. We're only spraying, I think we were spraying 3 to 4 gallons an acre when we were doing this. And so you can't be using any water that has any sediment at all. So we were having to transport a lot of water out there. We did, when we were looking at some of the chemicals to use, there was ones that kind of were asking for over the 5 gallons an acre, or ones that like say you could, but it wasn't very specific on some of the aerial applications. And then one of the new things that we have going is the federal legislation going on right now about not the use of Chinese drones, which that would be a bummer since we've only had these ones for the last couple years. And I still don't fully understand what's all going to be in this federal bill. So I guess if anyone's looking at getting a drone, you might want to pay attention to how this goes. I've heard everything of just it can't be made in China to they can't connect to the FAA service, which all the drones, especially when you're using commercially, they have to have a remote ID, which is kind of pings off the FAA server, kind of to let other planes and everything else kind of know who's up in the air and whatever else. And if we can't use that, you're grounded because you can't have that on their signal. So it's not even that it's made in China. It is just that you have to have that remote ID going, but you can't have that remote ID going on their server. We'll see how that ends up. And I just learned too here recently, there's even in Washington State a bill that was being introduced that would also prevent the use of Chinese drones. And I don't know exactly yet. Again, I haven't looked into it too deep on what that includes, if it is state agencies, if it is for commercial, we'll find out. Again, with some of these things we have learned with getting them licensed, especially the big one, due to its size, it actually gets a tail number. And we have not done this before. We are not in the aviation industry. And so it's been months that we've been even trying to get the paperwork done, not even sent in, but just get all the information and right stuff we need. I mean, it's getting to where we've had to go to the AG's office to say that DFW, Washington, the Fish and Wildlife, is actually a state agency, so that we can get one of the waivers of being an agency. It's not being used in a commercial setting, I guess. And so I would think at this point, we're probably looking at having to hire a consultant, which again increases costs on a lot of this stuff on what's already very expensive. And it's kind of disappointing because just talking to the people that have been flying the drones and these kinds of things a lot is that the DJI is just above and beyond on just their software platform, and what their drones can do and how they can kind of talk to each other. Whereas I think the only other one I can think of that is can spray is Helio, which is out of Texas. And they have nice drones, but again, the drone itself is well over 2 times the amount, and the software that went with them, at least when we were looking at them, was nowhere near what we're able to do with the DJI setup. So it's kind of like, are we even going to be able to use these very much in the future? Do you know what software they use to process the ortho? There is a lot. So there is a program that we have with that's called Smart Farm. It is the DJI software. Those will process the orthos. But then there's like Pix 4D that I know a lot of people are using for imagery, and there's a couple other ones that I'm not very familiar with that the RGIS program knows about. But again, a lot of those software kind of like stitching ortho, they're not cheap. So I haven't really got to play with them because I think a license was a couple grand. And so not knowing if it's going to fit our needs, I have not got the approval to kind of like just, I don't know, get a trial license. Do you know whether DFW need to apply for operational waiver from the FAA to conduct price? Um, I'm not quite sure what you mean by operational waiver, but yeah, so you have to have your Part 107, and then they have their ones to be able to fly over, fly drones that are over 50 pounds. And then there's also what the FAA calls the dispersion of economic poisons, which is your herbicide, but it's also anything else. Being these are used sometimes for farming, that includes fertilizer and even seeding. You have to get another endorsement for that. And then also the endorsement for, was it, I think they had one for out of line of sight for X amount of time. How much can the spray drone carry? Capacity 110 pounds. So the T40, that means it's 40 liters. But the I guess the contractor used he had the earlier version, the T30s, which are 30-liter capacity. But pretty much we got as that you never fill them to the full amount. They had ones that they were carrying, and I think they had a little bit too full. And then also, if they were in some hilly environments, kind of on the east side, some rolling hills, and the drone came up over a hill, and it's set to be at a certain distance over the ground. And so it tried to compensate and drop down. And then when it hit that, it tried to like hold all that weight from keeping going down, and it blew a motor. And then they had to go chase after their drone and kind of a goalie, which, yeah, they kind of learned, they were passing down some of our lessons from some of their bad experiences with that. But that is something that they've had happen to V4, is in requires maintenance too. Is after so much time, hours, whatever else, there is maintenance to these things that has to be logged. What is the cost difference between drones and a Marshmaster? Our Marshmaster, you're probably talking $200,000. Drone, you can get the spray drone itself is probably 15 to 20,000. And so you could get a pretty good size fleet of the spray drones going. Which the T40s, you can only fly by themselves. The contractor was using the T30s because they can link up. So each pilot can be flying 3 drones at a time. And so it just helps with their efficiency. And I think they had it down to pretty much a drone lands on the ground. And they pull batteries, fill it, and put new batteries in there in probably about 60 seconds. How long does drone battery last? Yeah, so the big ones pretty much 8 to 10 minutes, depending on how much you're carrying. There are some of those times when they were a little bit farther out there. They'd only fill the tank like half or quarter of the way full just so they could get some more battery time. So they could get it out there, spray it, and then get it back. But the controller, again, once you put it in there, you're monitoring, and it does pretty good at letting you know like how fast you're using it. I do believe we got the large seed spreader for the drone. And honestly, I haven't even been able to fly our big drone yet, because we're still working on getting that tail number, to get it registered with the FAA. So it's been sitting in storage for almost 8 months now. Just kind of sitting in the warehouse waiting until we can get those numbers. Because we have to have that before it can even get up off the air. On the land north towards legal use. Yeah, I'd be excited to just kind of see how this goes. And again, we have some of the areas that we do a lot of waterfowl forage, and it'd be nice just to even just filling those things full of your barley or millet and just going and spreading that around. Curious if you have good information about historical present abundance of native cattail on the sites. So what we were hearing, particularly we worked close with Greg Hood that didn't make it in the beginning, the second presenter, and he said he's only seen the native cattail a handful of times in I don't know how long he's been out there. Quite a while. And so most of it has been hybridized with the non-native, and that's one of the issues we're having is you see a lot of people talking about the cattail. They're 6-8 feet tall, but when we get into this on some of this hybridized cattail, I mean, I think we've probably found stuff that's 14. It was taller than the boom that we had up there. And yeah, it's definitely noticed some of it in the salinity. It just there's very specific parts on kind of where it goes, but then you'll just randomly see a clone farther out. That is the non-native. Using your ortho imagery and monitoring triggers. Yeah, so this is going to be in the fun thing too of kind of being able to fly over areas that we treated the year before. Probably in June, early July, trying to be able to fly over and see how your treatments actually worked. And is a bunch of non-native still coming back, or is it kind of the cattail dead for now, and then you ended up with all your plantain or whatever else that kind of starts coming in? And do you have software able to annotate it? The software side, we don't know yet. We have done a couple flights for our Spartina program, and trying to see, because those are usually individual plants, but the color is very vibrant compared to a lot of the sedges. So we tried to do flights over to see if we could get enough sample sizes that we could put into like one of those programs that would automatically kind of point out where the Spartina is. instead of having to do everything on foot. At least you have a good idea where like some of the heavy density is. But from what we were seeing, you were having to fly so low, the amount of data that you like, we were probably having to fly at 75 feet high. So that imagery data when you're doing, what is it, 70 by 80 overlap, like is so much data that it's questionable how much it's worth it. They released a list of approved drones on my phone. Otherwise, I'd like to find the list in case anyone's going to purchase one. Okay, so they did release a list. So that one I haven't seen that either. Possibly open source mapping tools. Yes. I am not the best GIS person. I barely get by. So when we get into some of the open source stuff, I am not really sure. I try to rely on the GIS department on some of that stuff. We were watering the plant areas, cut the plant down, and last this again. Okay, Jenny. So yeah, there's kind of the difference between excuse me. So I know there's some changes in the amount. So I guess with gallons per acre, even though we're still only doing 3 gallons per acre, we're still doing the label rate of whatever the four pints for what is it, the players. So even though on say the ground base, like the boom I guess section, we're probably putting 20 gallons an acre, so it's just a lot more carrier. Then so there's just a lot more water involved, and you can get a lot more done, it seems, with the drone without having to stop, set up. Which even for us, it was the biggest issue of just the refilling the drones versus the actual flying. We had, I think, 3 or 4 people like trying to keep up, filling the jugs to be able to fill the drones fast enough. When we have results on efficient drones, scroll video. I have no idea yet on the results that we'll have for the efficiency. It's kind of, hopefully we'll have something at least anecdotal at the end of midsummer next year. Once everything kind of starts to grow back and we can actually see how effective it was. But otherwise, I think that's it.
Oh, some more questions just trickled in.
Okay, have you used your drones to monitor your bird herding? So that is what I am trying to do right now. There between the snow geese and swans is trying to find probably good weather to do it. Between the freezing temperatures, which you can't fly those things at a certain temp, and then the amount of participation or the low cloud ceiling, that I haven't been able to fly too much. But yeah, we're trying to get it to where we can kind of tell kind of a juvenile to adult ratio, especially in the snow geese, since we know they end up losing a bunch, and then we had kind of some bouts with some bird flu. We tried to consider helicopter spraying for this project. Yes, we have done helicopter spraying twice. We did one kind of pilot project on a 10-acre chunk, which that one worked really well. And then we also did another one later that was 60 acres, I believe. And again, that worked pretty well. It's just the cost for what we're doing. A lot of the helicopters, they want big, wide, and long kind of routes to go in, and they can just kind of go fill it in. They're not doing this on, off, on, off, on, off, and they have to be going kind of a certain, I guess it seemed like a speed to kind of make sure that they were consistent. So being that we're doing some of the chunks that I think I showed earlier, kind of here. So they weren't spraying all in this green, but they're only doing this little green or little I guess I need a later pointer. They're not doing all the green, they're just spraying these little yellow things inside. So there's some of these ones where, I mean, you're talking a 50 by 50 foot patch, or sometimes even less, to some other bigger patches that were many acres. And so to be able to get a helicopter to go in there and do that was not cost prohibitive. And then we also were fighting some of that with the forestry and wildfires, is that a lot of the helicopters we get pulled into a lot of that stuff, and it just wasn't kind of worth it. Humidity, visibility. So I don't know, humidity, not so much. But just to be able to get up in the air, you have to have what your ceiling, 1,000-foot ceiling plus what, couple miles of visibility. And then yeah, you can, for label rate, it still applies. So it has to be under 10 miles an hour. So yeah, we kind of lucked out on the time. But there was a couple mornings that we pretty much just kind of had to sit there and walk around, do a couple coffee runs, waiting for the fog to lift so that we can have the ceiling to be able to fly. So yeah, that does affect, well, it does become a factor.